Guten Abend, meine Damen.
Good evening, ladies. Good evening, gentlemen in Davos, and good evening to the viewers at home in their living room watching TV. I am pleased that we are going to have this open debate on geostrategy, geopolitics. That's the subject tonight. What is the consequence of the worldwide vying for oil countries, oil-producing countries, to ensure access to what drives our country's oil? This is going to be resulting into more conflict. There already are some conflicts. What is the role of major countries, big countries like China, India? What is the key role of the key oil-producing country, Russia? What policy should be pursued by Western countries? And what other aspects of the energy policy, oil producing and oil policy in general? What is the responsibility with regard to the environment and its protection? And for this debate, we have a wonderful series of panelists, of experts here with us this evening, coming from nearly all walks of life and the four corners of the planet. And I'll be your modest and humble moderator as a journalist. Some very harsh words were said in a seminar a few days ago here at the World Economic Forum, where it was said that journalists were employed by their newspapers to separate the chaff from the rest and then to dry it. I'm sorry for this. And I'm sorry for making this accusation in the presence of my fellow journalist. Well, it may not apply to everyone. So let's concentrate on the essence. Mrs. Matthews, you are president of the oldest think tank of the United States, of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You have a lot of experience as a politician and a diplomat. You were Deputy Under-Secretary of State in the Council of Foreign Relations, member also of the editorial board of the Washington Post. So my first question is, don't you think that the most important instrument of foreign relations of the United States would be to start at last saving oil and energy?
Well, let me say first that it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank you for inviting me. The answer to your question is there are a great many things the United States has to do and has to change in its foreign policy. But with respect to energy, I would agree with you 100%. The United States has a unique level of waste.
Einen ganz besonders hohen Energieverbrauch. Und
if it wants to lower its trade deficit, if it wants to affect the policies of major oil producers whose policies right now and ambitions often hostile to the U.S. are swollen with oil revenues, if it wants to secure its long-term economic competitiveness, and if it wants to play its role in a stable planet through controlling climate change, all of those things would require recognizing what the United States has never yet been able to recognize, and which I don't believe we're ready yet to confront right now, which is that the cheapest, the quickest, and by far the largest source of new energy supply for the United States is reducing waste in what we currently use. Cheapest, quickest, by far the largest. But we're not yet ready, I think, really, I'm sorry to say, to grasp that nettle.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Madam Matthews, for that introductory statement. So we're going to put the same question to the panelists and then go into more detail. We are very happy to have Ajoy Dua here. He is the Vice Minister for Trade and Industry of India. He's an economist. He also studied at the well-known, the famous School of London School of Economics. He has published a lot on industrial development. Mr. Vice Minister, We hear so much about China's planetary policy to ensure its access to energy sources. Does India have the same kind of policy? We don't hear much about that.
I think you're absolutely right about it, that the demand for oil, even from India, is increasing as we grow a little faster than before. For the last 3 years now, our GDP has been growing at about 8.3% annually, and we are hoping that we would end the current financial year, which is March for us, at about closer to 9%. This reflects itself in higher need for energy. We are dependent on imports for 70% of our oil and gas. We have other fossil fuels, particularly coal and liquid coal, what's called normally lignite. But for oil and gas, we continue to be dependent upon the Middle East, we continue to be dependent upon Russia, and now even we've entered into some arrangements with African countries, including Nigeria and Sudan. Obviously, our foreign policy has to reckon with these facts that for quite some time we are going to be importers of oil and gas, though domestic production is increasing considerably, yet, and though in case of gas, in about 5 years' time or 6 years' time, we might have all the requisite gas which we need, but oil we would continue to be dependent upon various countries. And one or two ways in which we are tackling it is, one, to invest, apart from domestic sources, invest in overseas oil fields. We have now arrangements in 16 countries where we have put in equity in oil exploration and oil production. We think that these sort of arrangements do give us a higher sense of energy security than being dependent on only one or two sources.
Herzlichen Dank. Samuel.
Thank you very much. Samuel Ngifo, you are in Cameroon and you are the head of the Center of Environment and Development. It's an NGO. You're a lawyer. You're a lawyer for environmental matters, and you are monitoring the building of the pipeline between Cameroon and Chad and make sure that everything is okay from the international point of view. Now, we've spoken about India and China and the need for these two countries to energy and access to energy. Are you afraid that these countries will try and access the African continent after Europe has had so much control over Africa?
Thank you. Yes, I'm afraid, and especially because when I look back in the past and I see what has happened with Americans and Europeans coming in, looking for oil, there's no other option than to be afraid. Because now we have two new major players coming in, sorry, while the former players are still there. And looking at what is going on, looking at the trends, I think what is worse in the existing trends will continue. And what seems to be good is likely to disappear. I can very quickly say what falls within the two categories. What will happen is increased scarcity in terms of oil, access to oil. And now we have more players coming in. We also have to keep in mind that the domestic consumption of African countries is also increasing. So we really have a big battle for access to oil. And the problem is that having major players coming in will make the situation much more difficult. First, for countries in Africa which are not producing oil, it will be more and more expensive for them to have access to oil. And sometimes, even having money, they will not be able to have access to oil. It will also be very difficult for African oil producers countries, in the sense that all these big fights could probably result into more instability. Africa is becoming in the heart of the world somehow, especially the Gulf of Guinea. We have the Americans, we have many Europeans, we have the Indians in Nigeria, and we have the Chinese. All of them have very good links, or trying to have very good links with the leaders. And the problem is we don't have strong democratic institutions in place to face this type of massive invasion from foreign countries. Sorry to use the term invasion, but so this is the problem. So to summarize, we will have increased scarcity for domestic consumption, and also this will have an impact on the presence of countries coming in. We will have, I think, increased instability, or at least very much linked to this increased instability. We are likely to face a type of stability which will not be democratic, in the sense that we may have to reduce the type of democratic conditionalities that some of the countries, all producer countries in Africa, are facing. We have some examples from Sudan and other places of Africa where, because of the links with some of the new oil buyer countries, decisions at the UN Security Council, for example, were not very easy to reach as it was in the past. And we will probably have a race to the bottom in terms of social and environmental conditions for oil developments, in the sense that newcomers are not likely to go towards, well, they don't need to go towards European banks or the World Bank, for example, where we have some kinds of social and environmental roles. They are rich enough to have direct deals with the government. So to end up, we will have also more and more opacity in the oil industry. So the future is not very bright with this news.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. And even though you have made a statement that gives us a lot of concern and fills us with some fear. Now, what about the concern that we should have about Russia, this major oil-producing country? You have known Russia for a long time. You are an expert, have been one for 30 years, an expert on Russia and Central Asia. You've also written a book about Putin, and you are at the Council of Foreign Relations of Germany. Are you afraid of Putin? Thank you very much. We're going to have a very interesting discussion, I'm sure. I don't think that we need to have great fear of Russia, but Russia is undergoing change. And Russia ticks completely differently than in the 90s. And we still have this image of Russia of the time when Yeltsin went to begging through Europe, and when Russia was about to collapse. After the Cold War, in the 90s, we went through a period which we'll probably call the romantic phase sometime in history books of the future, where Europe had its liberal model, which it exported to the post-Soviet countries also. And then after the 11th of September 2001, we started on a new era. And after the struggle between Russia and Ukraine and White Russia, we are starting on an era of struggle or the tussle for energy and raw materials. We will probably have a time when there won't be any oil available in Norway, England or Holland, and we'll perhaps be less dependent on oil because you can always import it with tanker ships from Venezuela or elsewhere. But then you have Russia, Iran and Algeria, who will have to be our partners in the future. So we will have to enter into a strategic partnership with Russia. However, there is a threat because there are still the Russian oligarchs who are still drunk with all the oil and gas. They will try to use this to be partners or actors on the world stage of politics. And we will have to expect some very unpleasant times and moments. But I think there's a mutual need so that there's a possibility of agreement. I'm sure we can discuss this as well. Of course, Russia will try and play off Europe against Asia. Russia knows that everyone wants its resources. Russia is still the richest country in terms of raw materials, those that we need that are still underground. And the Chinese are already putting out feelers for these resources. Okay, we're really in the midst of this topic, says the moderator. We know what we are going to talk about, and I'd like to ask Andreas Zumach, who has been an observer of the international stage in Geneva. He has been writing for more than 20 years for the Swiss written press and also been very active on Swiss television. From what you have heard, do you think that we are moving towards a war about oil? Will we be moving towards an even more violent world? Well, the danger is very great, and in our previous or the preceding talk with you, you were asking me whether there is any strategy that is being developed and whether Europe should have such a strategy. I would say yes, it should have a new strategy that would have as a target to become as independent as quickly as possible and as soon as possible from fossil fuels. That we should have a more efficient use of energy. There's still a lot of margin there in Europe as well. There should be a drastic reduction in consumption, not only per capita but also per country. This afternoon we spoke about the 2,000-watt society. This is a possibility without having to go around in sackcloth. And then there's also a need for a major change to more sustainable and environmentally friendly sources of energy like solar power, wind power, and so on. Such a strategy should be possible in Europe. With such a strategy, we will reduce the danger or the threat of being at war because of the reducing energy resources in 20 years' time. Now, it was said that in 30 years' time, the EU will have more than 80% of its energy from abroad and will be dependent on Iran and Algeria. And this means that with such a dependence, there won't be an independent strategy of the EU, and there will be a lot of playing off one country against the other, and that, of course, increases the danger of military threat and military action to get access to these reduced resources. Mrs. Matthews, what about the current Iraq war? Is it the first oil war, the first in a long chain that Mr. Zumach fears?
I don't believe the Iraq War was about oil. There was nobody knows exactly what was in the president's mind in terms of what was the motivation. And there are lots and lots of writing and speculation in the United States about it. But the fact is that oil is there on the international market. If anything, in fact, the war has removed 2 million barrels a day from international production, and is one of the reasons why the market is so tight and prices are so high right now. In fact, the Iraq War, interestingly, is the largest international interruption in oil supply in history. larger than the Iranian nationalization of Iran's oil fields. So that was certainly something they didn't anticipate. But I don't believe it was an oil war. There were a lot of questionable motivations, but to me there's no evidence that it was about oil.
Let me put the question this way.
Can I just, let me just say two other things, though. I just sort of got to the comma there. Mm-hmm. I do think two things are going to happen in the near future that will change things dramatically. One is that all the geologists anticipate that sometime in the next 10 to 20 years, it's hard to know, maybe sooner, that world oil production will peak and begin to decline. Every time that has happened, either in an individual country or in an individual major oil field, it tends to be a very sharp peak, so the declines happen rather rapidly after. So that will change things in a way that will make the market much tighter. On the other hand, I also think that sometime in the next 5 years, there is going to be a major shock in the science about global warming. And I think it will be about the speed at which land-based ice, the glaciers and the ice sheets in the Arctic and the Antarctic are melting, which is much faster than the models predict, which means that sea level rise will be much faster than the models have predicted. And I believe that surprise, that shock, is going to finally galvanize action in the United States as well as elsewhere to deal with climate change, which in a very short order could loosen the market a good deal. But I don't believe we're going to have oil wars.
May I just interrupt this very briefly and say that since there is an empty chair here, would you perhaps move over so that we can have a closer ambiance in the discussion? And perhaps we could also arrange the nameplates accordingly so that you are sitting next to your nameplate. Question: is there particular danger of war in Asia where there is a lot of nationalism and perhaps a collision of nationalism between China and Japan, perhaps less between China and India? Is there a lot of vying there? Is this a risk of destabilization in Asia?
I don't think so. For one, Asia consumes much less energy than is being consumed elsewhere in the world. This is despite the fact that today we might be needing more energy as we grow faster, 10% rate of growth in China, 9% in India, etc. But this is all over a very small base. The scope for reduction in energy demand is fairly limited in certain countries, emerging nations of Asia. That point needs to be recognized as early as possible. I say this because today we find that the per capita annual energy consumption, for instance in India, is less than 1 barrel. China, about 2 barrels. I understand in the United States it's 28 barrels, and in the OECD is about 14 to 15 barrels per person. The scope for increase is there, and it is necessarily going to be there as we electrify more villages, more households. Today, still 30 to 40% of our rural areas, rural households do not have electricity. There is a problem today that though we might be growing fast, automobile consumption may be growing by 20%, 25%, but it still amounts to less than 1 automobile per 100 persons or per 100 households. See, there is no home heating at all in entire India. If that be so, where is the scope for reduction in energy consumption? I think the countries which have a higher per capita consumption, they need to look inwards and say, what can we do? Everybody is concerned about global climate change, all those things which Mrs. Matthews just mentioned very rightly, but the action has to be where the float or the margin is much more.
And Gifu, sehen Sie?
Mr. Gifu, and on your continent, do you see an increasing destabilization about oil wars? Is the war in Sudan, in Chad, and the various configurations of these wars, do you think there are wars about oil wars?
Obviously, yes. Oil is a major source of destabilization and conflicts in Africa. And this is a new trend also. My country, Cameroon, have been going through a war with the neighboring Nigeria for some few years, and finally the dispute ended up at the International Court of Justice. It was for a very small peninsula. No Cameroonian was living there. A lot of fishermen from Nigeria. But the only reason why Cameroon wanted to reaffirm its sovereignty on that small portion of land was because it's very rich in oil. And the oil production of Cameroon was declining. At the same time, we see similar problems between Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, and exactly for the same reasons. The oil production of Gabon is declining, while Equatorial Guinea is becoming one of the major oil producers in Africa. And there is a small island. Nobody has never requested to exerce the sovereignty of Gabon on that island, but because it's so rich in oil, and because having the sovereignty on that portion of on that island will also provide a control over the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf, which are very, very rich in oil, as you all know, in the Gulf of Guinea. So this is a major source of conflict. Also, as you said, between Gabon, between Chad and Sudan. But a part of these bilateral conflicts, we also have a lot of domestic problems which found their origin in oil. Sometimes not really in oil, but in the management of oil revenue. Because those who sign the contracts, oil contracts, are those in power. And signing oil contracts provides a lot of money to those in power and gives them an advantage on those in the opposition. And very often this is not accepted. And since we have so many new players coming in, you always find somebody who is ready to help a rebellion and to, well, get the contracts afterwards.
Andreas Zumach.
Andreas Zumach. I'd like to say something to Mr. Brown and Mrs. Matthews. I think we have to be very careful in the arguments. I do understand what Mr. Brown said, that the main problem is still located in the rich north, Europe and North America. An American professor mentioned the following figure. China in 30 years' time will have double the CO2 emission of all the 26 OECD countries, twice as much as the OECD countries. That sounds very threatening. But he also said that per capita, the Chinese CO2 emission is still half of what ours is. So we do have a lot of responsibility, but it is also true that the demand and supply of oil has exploded in China and in India. The Americans now consume 25 million barrels a day, and China is already at 12 million. 3 years ago, China was still at 6 million, so there's been a doubling within 3 years. This means, in other terms, that there are conflicts today. There are 3 conflicts which are all under the authority of the 3 countries that have the right to veto in the Security Council: Sudan, Iran, and increasingly the conflict in Zimbabwe. In all 3 cases, the central question is oil. I think you know this better than myself. The Bush administration put the government in front of the alternative of either increased cooperation, but then they would have to give up Iran, or cooperation with Iran, and the pipeline project that would go to China and India would die, and it's especially China that is trying to be convinced to drop it. So the scarcer oil and gas reserves are having more and more influence on how international politics are being pursued, and that is the real problem. If you look at the title of this year's meeting in Davos, The Shift in Power Relations, with this kind of slogan, one tries to pretend that everything is now the fault of India, China, and that all the consumption is only in India and China. So I do disagree entirely with you, Mrs. Matthews. The Iraq war was not exclusively a matter of oil, but primarily it was to make sure that there is access to a region where there's about 70% of the gas and oil reserves of the world. And it was also to stop what Saddam Hussein started to do in 2000, and that is to trade oil on the world markets, not in American dollars, but in euros. And the Americans were afraid that this would be copied and imitated by other countries. And look at a document dating back to 2002. First of all, the military strategy of September 2002, which only mentions terrorism and the spreading of mass weapons of destruction. But then look at what Dick Cheney said, the Vice President of the United States, as a representative of the oil groups, stating very clearly what the problem for America is in the next 10 years. That is, its oil dependence on imports from abroad will be from 53 to 64%, simply because one doesn't want to use one's own oil reserves, and that is why one needs more access and control in the Middle East and in Asia. There's also and this is to be defended in military terms as well, and then there are other documents where you have a very clear description of the scenario. Oil fields, those who control the oil fields will just turn off the tap, and that is where there would have to be military intervention. So the threat and the danger is much higher than we think. First, Mrs. Matthews.
Well, let's see where to begin. There was nobody in the American oil industry that was pushing to go to war in Iraq. Nobody. For the simple reason that the U.S. had access to Middle East oil. Indeed, the general view in the industry was this was going to make the region more unstable and therefore less good from an oil point of view. I think, the reasons that we did go to war were many. They had everything to do with 9/11, with the transformation of what was a failing presidency on September 10th, 2001, to a president who was instantly transformed into a popular commander-in-chief almost overnight. The sense that we had to punch back at somebody bigger than Afghanistan. A decade of criticism of Bill Clinton by key figures in the administration, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Paul Feith, others, and then the president's sort of dream about transforming the Middle East overnight into a region of democracies. I'm a close student of this, because I was a big part of the argument about not going to war in 2001, 2002, and I have never seen any credible or any argument from the inside, from the players themselves, that said that it had anything to do with oil, except that Iraq is in the Middle East. Huh? And but that does not mean any sense in the United States, and I think this is very important because it's very easy to get this sort of conspiracy theory, that we have a better access to oil by having 150,000 troops there. Look at, what has happened. Producers have to sell their oil. And we have now one of the things in the world that's better than after the 1973 oil embargo. We have a global oil market, and oil is fungible. It doesn't matter to whom it goes. Oil that reaches the international market has the effect on the price that importers feel everywhere. So I just feel very strongly that this is we in the United States right now are facing an enormous range of terrible problems. I think we've had a catastrophic presidency, and it's going to take us a generation to dig out of the damage that's been done. But the specter of oil wars is not on my list. I am happy to say it's a very long list, but it's not. I just don't think it's there. We do have a global oil market, and we do have producers who have to produce and sell. And so I think that's the good news. If I may just say one word about the other important issue about rich countries versus poor countries. If one thinks about carbon emissions on a or energy use on a per GDP basis, you have one picture of the important actors. If you think of it on a per capita basis, you have a very different one. The truth is we've got to deal with both. Because while it's true that the base of use in India and China is a fraction of the developed countries' use, it is also true that together, 2 billion people, they are a third of the world's population, and the U.S. is 6%. So if we're going to have a successful effort to deal with climate change, it cannot be either or, it's going to have to be both.
Your answer to both.
I couldn't more agree with Mrs. Matthews on this, but the fact of the matter is we have to look at the composition of energy in China and India. We are far more dependent on coal, which everybody knows is not a clean fuel. We have to necessarily burn it to produce our electricity. 70% of Indian electricity comes from coal. The dependence on coal is equally high in China. The question before us is, how does one replace coal with cleaner fuels or bring in technology to burn the coal better and in a cleaner manner? All these are expensive propositions which make electricity production costlier than it is today. But having said that, one does not in any way I'm not trying to underplay the need for our moving to cleaner fuels and emissions being much lower than what it is today. However, I'd like to say there is a need now for the world as a whole to move to non-hydrocarbon fuels sources much more than ever before. Renewables, hydroelectricity, as well as nuclear power, with all the possible safeguards which one can put in if we have to really look at things in the long term. We don't produce much nuclear energy, 3% of our requirement, or 3.5%. France does it well, 70%. The fact is that people are afraid of use of nuclear sources, but we must have, in the long term, this as an alternative to meet the global requirements if we are really moving to cleaner or concerned about climate change. Finally, just on this issue, I'll just go back to the fact that wherever the energy use or the intensity of use is high, we necessarily have to reduce its consumption, both in generation, supply side, as well as in the demand side. But a lot of these things require technology, a lot of resources, as well as tightening of the belt of the countries which are affected by it, and that means everybody in the world.
Was wir hören,
Alexander Ra, what we hear here has been said very diplomatically and kindly, but it is an announced war about distribution. What role will Russia play? On whose side will Russia be, and how will it use its power as an oil producer? Yeah, well, that's geopolitics, isn't it? Right in the midst of it. And you probably want us to add some salt, some spice to the soup. Yeah, well, I like spicy food, says the moderator. Okay, let me say this in a very provocative way. In the case of the Iraq war, we are seeing a new center of power being built up in Asia. Who would have thought that Russia, India and China would be able to create this pool, a new pool of world power? This is still at the beginning. It's still in its infant steps. But in this forum, China and India will have to talk about all sorts of things, and Russia is also adopting a leading role. Here, there's not much talk about terrorism, but simply energy and the pipelines that will have to be built between Russia and Asia, the transportation of oil and energy from the greater Middle East to Asia. In the meantime, China has already built and opened up 2 military bases in Central Asia for cooperation with Russia. We're not really interested in that in Europe. We believe that we determine world politics, but that's of course not true. So this Shanghai Forum and the cooperation within this forum should be of concern to us, both in a positive and negative way. In fact, what this is a worldwide nationalization of energy. The large groups have lost most of their power, not only in Russia and in Asia, but also in Norway, in the West. A lot is being nationalized simply because the governments have understood that this is a powerful tool that helps them deepen their influence and also protect them from global threats in this area. Of course, Russia, to answer the question put by the moderator, Russia is trying to play its role to the hilt. In the 90s, Russia experienced being pushed to the margin with its back to the wall. Then there was the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you knew anything about the former Soviet Union, well, compared with the past, the country has nothing to say anymore, or didn't have anything to say anymore. But President Putin is trying to regain ground that has been lost and to return to the world political stage. Fortunately, not with military power, because it doesn't have that anymore, but with the tools of oil and gas. So how can we respond? We are very naive. We believe in the European Union. We think that we can force Putin to be on our side and to sign the oil charter, but Putin will not sign it. 3 days before the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was tabled, and to put it very pointedly, the Soviet Union was supposed to accept that it was Europe that would have control over all the pipelines that would be built. In fact, Norway didn't sign this charter either because they didn't want to give up their transport monopoly. So we'll be going through very difficult times. We will have to discuss a new energy charter with Russia, where the interests of the consumer countries, that's to say our interests, and the interests of the producing and transit countries will have to be considered in this new play between those who are involved. The transit countries have a certain monopoly as well. They are abusing this power. You know that they want to have a part in this political interplay. All this will have to be seen in a general context. It'll need a lot of courage and a lot of understanding, a lot of political nous to admit that the transit countries too have more leverage than in the past. And if this isn't to work out, then I can very well imagine what will happen. We will simply return to nuclear energy. In the next 20 years, Russia is supposed to build 26 new nuclear power plants, and in the Ukraine and in Belarus as well. More nuclear power plants are supposed to be built, even though the era of Chernobyl is not over. And this has to be considered in international cooperation. Another question from the moderator. You were just recently on a visit to the president and dictator of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko. What was your impression? Well, I was there as a journalist and an analyst. He wanted to give an interview to a Western newspaper and perhaps also appeal to the Western public. The Western public is perhaps quite interested in what Lukashenko does, what he thinks, and what makes him tick. So I interviewed him for Die Welt. This interview was published yesterday in that newspaper. And I think it's interesting to have some insight into how this autocrat thinks. And Belarus is really a very interesting example of what energy policy can do. A country that relied on very cheap raw materials from Russia, that never really had an independent economy, always believing that the big brother would help. And now there's this fight and quarrel with Russia. Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO and knows that there's not going to be a reunification with Russia, and Russia is refusing to sell cheap oil and gas to these two countries anymore. But these are countries that have a transit monopoly. Russia can only export its gas and oil to the West through Ukraine and Belarus. And they are saying, well, we can play the game as well of turning off the tap. We can also exert pressure and blackmail you. That is the game that took place in 2006. Not a very pretty game, but things are improving.
Before you put questions, ladies and gentlemen, to the panelists, one last subject about which I would like to have a brief statement from each of our panelists. Against the background of this diagnosis, what is the therapy? What is the cure? Are there international institutions who can bring order into this chaos? Or is it simply necessarily going to be the right of the strongest? Let me ask you how you see it.
Yep.
I think it's a very difficult question. Looking at it from a producer country, I think it has always been the right of the stronger. And I don't see why and how this can change. One way to make things easier for producers countries and to reduce the pressure on oil will be a diversification. We have been talking about that since this morning, this afternoon, but I think it's very urgent that the world, the leaders decide to diversify their source of energy. Oil should not be the target, should not continue to be the target. We will be short of oil in a very short time, and if there is a diversification, there will be less fight for the last drops of oil that we still have. And I think this will be the only solution.
Mrs. Matthews.
Well, let me start by reminding people that in 1979, the price of oil went higher in real terms than it is today. And by 1986, the price had dropped so low that the United States sent its vice president, who was then the senior Bush, to Saudi Arabia to ask the Saudis to cut back on their drilling so that the price would go up. Let me remind you, too, that it was only 6 years ago here at Davos that the CEO of British Petroleum, of BP, publicly raised the issue about the fear of what would happen if the price of oil went below $10 a barrel. 6 or 7 years ago. So these things change radically. And the price of oil goes through huge swings, so please don't leave here with the conviction that we're into a permanent oil shortage world. I don't think that's true. That said, I think there are things and international institutions that are important that will cushion the current tightness. One is it's terribly important that India and China are brought into the International Energy Agency, which does a lot to create a smoothly functioning world market. Second, we need more sharing of information, which also makes price fluctuations much smoother. Third, we need more construction of strategic petroleum reserves so that you can cushion both political acts and also natural acts like Hurricane Katrina, which took out a quarter of the American oil production and refining for some period of time. So there are a number of things that can be done over the short term that will improve the situation drastically, but there are enough uncertainties here for you to keep in mind that this is not a new, I don't believe, a new world that we're entering with respect to oil.
I think today we have a situation where the oil producers, so-called OPEC countries, members of OPEC, are able to play the consumers against each other. Let's accept this fact that when it comes to buying oil, I don't think the countries act in unison. If the major consumers of oil, whether it's the United States, EU, Switzerland, Japan, India, China, were to act in...
Not in that order.
No, not in that order at all. I'm certainly not saying that. I was saying it more by way of examples. Were to be effective consumers' union, a consumer union or a consumer, then I think the whole gamut of things change. After all, a commodity is valued only when there is a demand for it, and if people are willing to pay any amount of price for it. If it is the demand or the consumers themselves get their act together, come in together, I think a number of things, including the so-called oligarchies or the monopoly effects resulting in wars, conflicts, etc., would probably then can be viewed a little differently.
Alexander nicht Alexander, sondern
Andreas Sumach. Well, I have to disagree with Mr. Matthews. I hadn't intended to, but I'm sorry, Jessica. I think what you were saying was a rather dangerous playing down of the danger. What we've seen, the fluctuations we've seen in the oil price in the last decades, that's already history. Everything that happened to the oil price since the oil shocks. And we have to assume that the estimates about the existing reserves, Saudi, Iran, Iraq, smaller Gulf states and so on, they all have an interest in exaggerating their reserves, of course. And the International Energy Agency reckons about 1,000 million barrels, which is a fraction of what used to be available on the Earth. Maybe it's 6 billion less, but we do now have very clear forecasts as to the demand and the increase in consumption over the next decade, the next 25, next 40 or 50 years. Very much differentiated, different from region to region. China, India, we here in Europe, North America, Japan, and I only mentioned two figures. By 2025, there'll be a doubling of the demand from what there was in 2000, and by the 2050, it'll be a further doubling. Now, we need to be clear that we are now entering upon a situation when the price will certainly be up to 200 per barrel, if not more. So the situation is dramatic, but even if Even if we were still in the situation which we thought we were in back in 1970, let's just assume that for a minute and just set aside the environmental problems. So even if there weren't any problems of distribution, we still got the confounded problem with the use of our resources in oil and gas and so on. We're creating the problem of destruction of the environment and so on. For that reason, we have to get away from fossil fuels as soon as we can. So the question is, which faces international institutions, I don't think that the International Energy Agency is the right answer. You rightly indicated that they don't actually have any strategy, although their ideas are more or less sensible, and except to get away from fossil energies as soon as possible. What is remarkable about the whole global threat and the challenge, if I look most recently at what Kofi Annan was saying, and the hunger, AIDS, underdevelopment, terrorism, poverty, WMD, organized crime, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of list of ills on which humanity is more or less agreed. But above all that is the energy question. The energy issue in terms of resources is something it does belong with the United Nations. As I've indicated, there has to be an institutional reflection on all of that.
Was tun, fragte Lenin, und ich.
What is to be done? And I'd like to ask Alexander Rao, what is to be done? In which direction? India, Russia, China? As far as Europe is concerned, there isn't a strategic partnership. I'm a Russia specialist, and I find the European Union is thinking in terms of a transatlantic partnership and zone is between the European West and America in order to create free trade areas with the former Soviet Union and Belarus and Central Asia. But we need to take an entirely different view. If there were to be, if a democratic regional government is going to come into being or be elected in Russia, if we could go back to the ideas of Gorbachev and Perestroika, then perhaps there would once again be a common European area in which we could do something. Many of the comments made in Russia against us or on our part against Russia, they remind me of the Cold War. And perhaps the problem really has its roots in the Middle East or the former Warsaw Pact countries that are still angry with Russia. And they can't stand the idea of Russia as the ruling power. But we have to think of ways of creating the common European house, so that is a vision which has got lost in recent years. But if we look at the security and the energy issues, we need to reanimate that idea of the common European home. Thank you very much. Well, now could I invite you, the audience, ladies and gentlemen, whether you want to express yourselves diplomatically or not, as you wish, but make it brief so that we can have as many questions as possible. So, where is the first request for the floor?
Hier. Bitte schön, warten Sie.
Could you please wait till the microphone reaches you? In Switzerland, there is a fair oil initiative and a fair trade label for petroleum products. That's an idea. Anyway, what do you think of that idea? And so it'll be possible then to buy oil products which aren't covered in blood, which don't have any blood price. Well, can there also be fair trade in the oil business? That's the question.
from the experience I have, I think it will really be difficult to have fair business in oil products. There are many reasons for that. The first reason is that I told you about opacity. This seems to be a role in the oil business. It's very difficult to know what is going on, to know who is doing what. This is really, really difficult when you come from a producer country. The government knows it sometimes, not all, but the companies for sure know it. And it will be very difficult to have an independent party coming to certify, not knowing, not being there all the time. The second reason is that some of the problems created by the oil industry will not appear at the time of the production. There are long-term problems that will appear sometimes long after the end of the production. So it will be very difficult to certify on the grounds of what you see at a given time, not knowing what will happen, especially some of the social problems. I can very quickly quote one example, if I have the permission to do that. Recently, in the year 2000, the World Bank and many of the northern countries approved the fundings for a major oil pipeline from Chad to the Atlantic Sea through Cameroon. And it was designed as being a model project. The bank wanted to use it as a window to show that they are able to get involved into this type of huge investment. So this was really a major project, very well built, very well monitored. But what happened was that, well, two things. First, there was a clear request on the side of the NGOs to say, if you want to monitor the social impact of your project, we want to have baseline data on the HIV spread along the pipeline route before so that we can monitor. This was not done. And second, a study was done recently at the end of the construction. It was very difficult to compare with baseline data. Baseline data did not exist. But what we realized was that along the pipeline route, in some of the places, half of the people were contaminated, half of the adults were contaminated with the HIV. So it's very difficult to know. If you come at the time of the construction, you won't be able to see such an impact. But afterwards, you may be able to see this type of problems. And I'm sure there are many more problems that we are not yet seeing so far, that will still be appearing. So I think it will really be dangerous and difficult. And I will again advise that we look strategically in the future. And we don't think the solution to the energy problems are linked with oil. We really have to separate the two issues. We have to start getting out of it. And trying to build a new system with certification is a way to stay there, to try to improve what is designed to be out of business very quickly.
Thank you very much. Die nächste Frage, bitte.
The next question.
Bitte schön, die Dame hier vorne.
The lady here in front.
Wobei ich kurzsichtige.
And I, being myopic, I don't wish to give short shrift to the people at the back.
An article that appeared in the Davos special edition of Newsweek magazine said, well, challenged provocatively the claim that we are close to the bottom of the barrel, that there is going to be an oil shortage. What do you think of this? Is our best bet to stay the course with oil, or are alternative energies in order? And if any of you suggest nuclear energy, what do you do with the waste?
Mrs. Matthews, this is an opportunity to answer the question, and to Andreas Zumach.
Well, I think that I tried at least to tell you that I think that we have to be very aware of all the uncertainties in the world oil market, and not leap to the conclusion that we are in any way, quote, running out of oil. So I didn't see the article you mentioned, but I would agree with that if that's what it said. Look, fossil fuels are 80% more of global energy use, so we're not going to stop using fossil fuels. What we can do and what we must do, especially the United States where the situation is the worst, is to squeeze the most amount of energy services, of usable energy, out of every BTU that we burn. The U.S. has been variously estimated to have something like 40% of its current energy use that could be eliminated with current technology through the right policies. That is more than solar, wind, geothermal, every possible alternative energy you can think of put together. And that's where the biggest resource is. I mean, you think of the U.S. economy as a giant wet sponge, the U.S. energy economy, that needs to be squeezed. And even in Europe and also in the developing countries, because poverty also produces its own kind of inefficiency that is severe. So there is, and my guess is that when the world realizes that it has to confront climate change, and here I don't think there's a bit of difference between us. I think this need is real, and that the realization is going to come with some kind of shock, and I mentioned the one I think is most likely in the next short period of time, that we will discover that there is a huge untapped energy resource out there called inefficiency. Just a word on nuclear. Nuclear has an important role to play in a climate-constrained, in a carbon-constrained world. There are two problems: waste and proliferation. If right now the non-proliferation regime in the world is on the verge of collapse, mostly because of U.S. policies, unless those policies are changed, and unless we can reconstitute that regime in strength, then a move towards major construction of nuclear energy would be the Pyrrhic victory, the worst Pyrrhic victory of all time. Waste disposal is simpler. We in the United States have had a policy for 55 years that has now proven beyond all doubt that it's failed. And that is to put stuff deep in the ground, seal it up, and leave it there forever. And that where it's supposed to be able to be proved that it will be safe for 10,000 years. The figure 10,000 years has no basis in science whatsoever. A policy that puts the waste underground but near the surface where it can be monitored, and which relies on man-made technology, casks and storage equipment rather than geology to keep the stuff safe, will work. And it's a question of how long it's going to take us to get there politically. I think the basic right answer about nuclear is nuclear energy as an energy source should rise or fail on the merits, but it should not simply strangle on its own waste for political reasons. That it is an energy supply that we need, but there are these two huge, particularly the proliferation issue, that has to be solved first.
Darf ich an die Frage...
Could I follow on from the question put by the lady, Alexander Rao, on going back to the ideas that were current in the 1960s, when the left was very much in favor of nuclear energy, whereas the right was rather skeptical. And then it tipped over. It turned around. Is it thinkable that we could have a debate today where the left is mostly hostile to nuclear power, whereas the right would want to see it brought back? In your own country, Germany, particularly strongly so. So is this a turnaround? Really, that we're going to see a move back to atomic energy? I think Germany is a special case. Austria perhaps as well, and Scandinavia and the other Europeans are still looking to safe nuclear energy. In Germany, I think it was less from the left and the SPD as it was from the Greens. They wanted to see developed a program which clearly bore their imprint. and that induced the SPD to share that position. I personally believe, I'm politically independent, I think that we are going to be reverting to nuclear power. We will have to weigh, of course, what is more dangerous today, either building more nuclear power plants or the alternatives. I think we will be reverting to that, if only because companies like France or the United Kingdom, the Benelux states, and finally the Eastern Europe countries are going to be very much involved with nuclear power, and we can't remain the island of the blessed, Germany. So it is going to be important, of course, that we endeavour, notwithstanding, we do try to influence the technology and make sure that these countries of the old Second World, Ukraine, Belarus, the Balkan states, Central Asian states, Southern Caucasus. We want to make sure that they deal more safely with the technology. What happens if things go wrong? I'm sure that Chernobyl is going to echo for generations. Andreas Schumacher, a word from you.
The question was whether we've reached the bottom of the barrel. I've already said so, yes. I don't want to explain it again. I just would like to remind you of a fantastic film that was shown to 13 people at the Solothurn Film Festival 3 days ago, and it was called Crude Awakening, not Rude Awakening, but Crude Awakening. It's a play on words. I can't remember who the person was who made this film. It's a Swiss person, but it's an excellent display of what is happening in the area of oil, and you can look for it on the internet. Now, I think it would be devastating if we were to do what you seem to say is inevitable. I would think it would be the most stupid solution or decision. First of all, for the reasons given by Mrs. Matthews. None of the security problems that we've been discussing since the 60s have been resolved yet. We've been very, very lucky, damn lucky, that there's only been one Chernobyl. That was crude, says the moderator. And to say that the reactors built by the West are safer now is only relative. It's not an absolute guarantee. Thirdly, and this brings me to money, none other form of energy has cost so much in public money as nuclear power has in the last 40 years. More than all other energies taken together, oil, gas, and the renewable sources of energy. So also in economic terms, in financial terms, in relation to global economies and national economies, it would be sheer nonsense to do this. And it's a real myth, this thing about Germany. Most people don't know this. It was certainly not in the interest of the four major oil groups to build nuclear power plants in the 60s. They had already examined this very carefully and concluded that it wasn't worthwhile. It wouldn't pay. It would be a loss-making business. But why did Germany nonetheless put everything on nuclear power? The Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, the CDU, and Franz Josef Strauss, the Minister of Defense, wanted to keep open the option of developing atomic weapons. Exactly what is being reproached, what Iran is being reproached for now. We're talking about the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. The government, the German government, therefore forced the four big oil companies to go into nuclear energy and made it a sweeter dose to swallow by giving subsidies. Look at the figures. We have 435 nuclear power plants worldwide. They generate 7% of the world's energy consumption. If nuclear power is to play a significant role in the future, that is to say, to overcome this gap, the shortfall that Mrs. Merkel is mentioning here and everywhere, then we would need to double the output in the next 20 years, output from nuclear energy. This would mean that in the next 20 years, a new power plant would have to be added to the power grid every 2 weeks. And since worldwide consumption has already risen, as I said, worldwide, we would only be covering 9% of the world's consumption and not 14%. So it's not worth it. And then the raw material, uranium, is also being exhausted. It is not infinite. So if you dropped all of this, it has to be seen in economic and financial terms. Next question. Someone has put up his hand right at the back of the room, in the middle of the room. Question to Ms. Ngufo. All these conflicts that you've described, what about the role of the African Union? Could the African Union intervene to some extent?
Some few years ago, there was a decision to increase the role of the African Union in addressing conflicts in Africa. But there are many reasons why the African Union cannot intervene in this type of conflicts. First, the African Union do not have enough money to have a permanent force or to be able to send soldiers in every places where there are conflicts. Second, in some cases, the states involved are very powerful, are also key players in the African Union. It was the case with the conflict between Nigeria and Cameroon, and it was almost impossible for the African Union to have a decision on that. Nigeria is one of the most powerful countries in Africa, and at some stage during the conflict they were chairing the African Union, so it was not possible to have a decision there. But it is really difficult also, according to the rules of the African Union. It's a meeting of sovereign countries, and they all have to agree on each of the decisions that they take. And very often some of the states think about they don't want to set precedents, because they know the type of decisions that they are taking today could also apply to them the following day. So very often they tend to pull out of the conflict and to look for external solutions. This is the case with Sudan, it was the case with Nigeria, it's the case between Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, where Kofi Annan was asked to be a mediator also.
Thank you very much. Wir haben jetzt noch eine Vielzahl.
Lots of people have asked for the floor, but we only have 5 minutes. I'm going to take 3 questions, and they may only be 1 sentence long. Otherwise, we won't manage to fit them in 5 minutes with the answers. No, 1 sentence is not enough. No. Otherwise, you won't get the floor if it's more than 1 sentence. The wars are about oil because resources are finite. So don't we need a strategy like solar for peace? So my question is, don't you think that the UN should have an agency that would control the availability of resources so that the poor countries don't fall off the wagon and NATO countries make sure that they get all the resources? Thank you for that question. Then there's another question right at the back of the room in front of the interpreters' booths. I'd like to ask the gentleman from Cameroon a question, Mr. Ngufo. I'm African myself. I come from Ethiopia. I was born in Ethiopia. You are saying that the African Union has no power. But that it is corrupted. And in any case, they are trying to get other countries to solve their problems, but they have to reach some kind of agreement, the countries that are members of the African Union. So we really should solve our problems ourselves and rather find fault with other countries. Thank you very much.
Latif Al-Othman from Saudi Arabia. And my comment is that energy has been a critical factor in fueling the world economy. And we often take it for granted. But it's very dangerous if we make decisions based on wrong information. We've heard discussions about peak oil. I think the discussion on peak oil is what peaked. The world has only spent 1/3 of the world proven reserve. If you add possible and probable, you're talking about 8 trillion more to come. I believe that through technology and human ingenuity, we will enjoy oil for many years to come. Yes, it's depletable, and therefore we need to conserve and we need to protect the environment.
Danke wiederum für diese Stellung.
Well, thank you very much for that statement.
And we need to promote policies that promote interdependence, not isolation.
Thank you very much. Eine letzte Stellungnahme.
One last statement or question from a lady. I can't see whether the person is a lady or gentleman. Sorry. That's my short-sightedness. But I'm sure we'll know in 2 seconds once the person starts speaking. It's a gentleman. Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Zumach. How do you see this 2,000-watt society? At lunchtime at the forum, we seem to be told that it's an illusion, but you seem to be saying that it's quite something feasible. Mr. Zumach, a short answer, please. Very short. That was the problem of the discussion this morning. The person who said that this was an illusion, a person representing industry, also said there's so many constraints in society, and we was asked to mention one of these constraints, and he came up with none. And Mrs. Teuchner, who represented the Swiss Parliament and who's in the Green Party, then mentioned some of the things that would be necessary to achieve this society, like driving cars that only consume 2 liters every 100 kilometers instead of on average 8.8, and that wouldn't be so bad. It's feasible. I think there's a lot of shadow boxing here and drawing the devil on the wall. I think we can find exactly what it would entail, this 2,000-watt society. It doesn't mean that we'll have to go cold and hungry or have a terrible life, but we might be even happier than we are today. Mr. Dürr? The question about the UN.
Yeah, I don't think there is one solution to the problem that we go nuclear or we don't go nuclear. What was being mentioned is that there are a host of options. Each one of them will need to be weighed technologically, economically, and then a decision taken. We should not rule out any particular option. A specific question on solar, which was asked, I think the problem in solar energy is still technological related. Countries which seem to have the technology don't have much of sun. And the countries which have the sun don't have the technology or the money for it. Having said that, let me just refer to the specific question which was asked by the moderator. There is certainly a need for a much stronger, much more effective international institution to manage the energy scenario. We realize its cross-cutting influence on climate change, on a whole lot of economic issues, issues relating to lifestyles and others are all a part of it. We must think of whether it's under the umbrella of the United Nations, because people can question the efficacy of United Nations or its institutions, but I won't be able to say whether it should be under the UN or otherwise, but certainly a far more effective arrangement both to manage supply side and as well as the demand for energy is required.
Meine Damen und Herren, am Schluss.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the debate, we have seen a ray of sun shining into this hall, and the whole debate has been quite energizing. I've been surrounded by a society of experts and people with a lot of knowledge. I'm very grateful that we've had such committed and interesting panelists. It may sound a bit old and worn, but it is true. Thank you very much. A round of applause for the panelists. Well, thank you. We even get gifts. I've received a small bunch of flowers that I would like to pass on and give to those who have allowed us to meet tonight, those who have made this debate a success. And I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence and attendance and your committed participation. At the last open forum that I was able to moderate, I asked you about the difference between the optimist and the pessimist, and today I'll ask you about the difference between the optimist, the pessimist, and the engineer. The optimist says, well, the glass is drink, is half full. The pessimist says the glass is half empty, and the engineer says the glass is twice as large as it should be. We've tried to be as realistic as possible. Goodbye.
Darf ich Sie daran erinnern?
Let me just remind you that the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches is inviting you to informal discussion at the tea room Trocolino. You leave the hall and go to the right, and then up at the promenade to the left, 100 meters further on to the right. And enjoy the evening.